The radio crackled once, softly, and then went dead. I was standing between aisle J and K when it happened. Halfway through a sentence, I hadn't realized I was whispering out loud. The warehouse lights above me hummed the way they always did, steady and dull, but the sound felt thinner now, like it had less weight to it. I waited for the radio to come back. It didn't. I stood there longer than I should have, staring down the aisle, trying to remember why I'd stopped walking in the first place. I worked overnight security at a distribution warehouse on the edge of an industrial park. No windows, no public access, just rows and rows of shelving stacked higher than a house, filled with boxed inventory that never moved at night. My job was simple: walk the floor, check the doors, log the times, keep the place from feeling empty, even though it always was. Most nights, the routine ran me instead of the other way around. Clock in at 10, grab the radio, the flashlight, and the clipboard. Walk the same path in the same order every hour. Dock doors first, then the loading bays, then the long interior aisles. The building was big enough that by the time I finished one round, it was almost time to start the next. That night, everything was on schedule until it wasn't. The first round passed quietly. The docks were sealed. Motion sensors stayed green. The emergency exits were locked from the inside, just like they were supposed to be. I wrote the times down, checked my watch, and kept moving. My footsteps echoed back at me from the concrete floor, each one sounding a little louder than it should have. By the second round, the silence felt heavier. Not louder, not dramatic, just heavier, like the air had thickened. The warehouse always had noise, vents, distant refrigeration units, the subtle tick of cooling metal, but that night, it felt like all of it was coming from farther away. I remember thinking it would be a long shift. I reached aisle F when I noticed the first thing that didn't line up. A pallet jack was sitting slightly out of place, angled across the aisle instead of tucked against the shelving. It wasn't unusual to see equipment left out after the day's shift, but this one was different. I'd logged that aisle an hour earlier. It hadn't been there then. I stood with my pen hovering over the clipboard, staring at it. If you were there, you might have ignored it too. It was easy to assume I'd just missed it earlier. Easy to tell myself I was tired. Overnight shifts mess with your sense of certainty. So I nudged the pallet jack back into position and kept walking, the wheels squealing softly before settling into silence again. By the time I finished that round, I'd already stopped thinking about it. The radio stayed quiet. Normally, it chirped every so often with a system check from the guard at the front office. That night, nothing. I pressed the talk button once just to test it. Static hissed back at me, thin and weak. Copy check, I said, feeling a little foolish talking to myself. No response. I told myself the front desk guard was probably on break or dealing with paperwork. It wasn't unusual. The warehouse was so far back from the main office that radio reception was spotty at the best of times. Still, I clipped it back to my belt instead of holding it in my hand like I usually did. Somewhere during the third round, I realized my footsteps were overlapping. At first, I thought it was just the echo playing tricks on me. Sound bounced strangely between the shelves, especially in the longer aisles. But when I stopped walking, the sound didn't stop right away. It carried on for half a second longer, just enough to make my stomach tighten. I stood still, listening. Nothing followed. No movement. No voices. Just the hum of the lights overhead. I laughed quietly, more out of habit than humor, and started walking again, slower this time. Each step landed cleanly. No extra echoes. No delay. I didn't write it down. Halfway through the next aisle, my flashlight flickered. Just once. The beam dimmed, then returned to normal. I tapped it against my palm, annoyed more than scared. Cheap equipment was part of the job. Still, I swapped the batteries when I passed the supply cabinet, even though they'd been replaced earlier that week. That was when I noticed the logbook on the desk. It was open. I'd closed it myself before heading out. I was sure of it. I always closed it, slid it under the desk lamp, and turned the lamp off. Now the lamp was on, and the logbook was flipped back a few pages. I leaned closer, scanning the entries. My handwriting filled the page. Times, checkpoints, all normal. Then near the bottom, a line I didn't recognize. 2:17, interior patrol paused. I checked my watch. 2:03. I stare at the line for a long time, try to convince myself it was old. But the ink was fresh. The pen mark hadn't soaked into the paper yet. I reached out and brushed my thumb across it. It smeared slightly. I hadn't written that. I stood there, listening to the quiet office, the faint buzz of the lamp, the distant whine of machinery somewhere deep in the building. My chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath without noticing. I picked up the radio again. "Front desk, do you copy?" I asked. Static answered, louder this time. I didn't sit down. I didn't add anything to the log. I turned off the lamp, closed the book, and clipped the radio back onto my belt with hands that felt a little less steady than before. When I stepped back onto the warehouse floor, the lights above aisle J were off. Not dimmed, off. That section was supposed to stay lit all night for safety reasons. I knew that. Everyone knew that. I stood at the edge of the aisle, staring into the darkness between the shelves. The blackness felt deeper than it should have, swallowing the light from the surrounding rows. I clicked my flashlight on and swept the beam slowly across the floor. Boxes, racks, nothing out of place. I stepped forward, then stopped. The floor was scuffed with fresh marks, shoe prints leading down the aisle and stopping abruptly halfway through. They didn't turn. They didn't fade. They just ended. I backed out of the aisle and stood there for a full minute, listening to my own breathing echo inside my ears. Then I did what the job trained me to do. I logged it. 2:22, aisle J lights off. Investigating. As soon as the pen left the paper, the radio crackled again. This time it wasn't static. It was breathing, soft, close, like someone holding the mic too near their mouth without speaking. I froze, fingers digging into the clipboard. I waited for a voice to follow. 1 second passed, then 2. I pressed the talk button. "Who's on channel?" I asked. The breathing stopped. The radio went dead. I didn't finish that round. I headed back toward the office, walking faster now, my flashlight beam darting ahead of me. The warehouse felt longer than before, each aisle stretching out, refusing to end. When I finally reached the desk, I locked the door behind me even though there was no policy that said I needed to. I sat down and waited. Minutes passed. My watch ticked steadily. The radio stayed silent. The logbook sat closed on the desk, exactly where I'd left it. At 2:41, there was a knock. It came from inside the building, not the office door. A dull, rhythmic sound, metal on metal. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the interior wall, the one that backed onto the warehouse floor. Someone was knocking from the other side. I stood up slowly, every muscle tight, and pressed my ear against the wall. The sound stopped as soon as I got close. The silence that followed felt intentional, like whatever was out there knew I was listening. I didn't respond. The knocking didn't come back. By the time morning shift arrived, the warehouse lights were all on. The radio worked perfectly. The front desk guard swore he'd been at his station all night and hadn't logged any system checks. The logbook entry at 2:17 was still there, exactly as I'd seen it before. Management chalked it up to a glitch. Fatigue, a miscommunication. They offered to move me to a different site. I took it. A week later, I stopped by the warehouse to return my badge. As I signed out for the last time, I noticed a new line in the logbook written beneath my final entry. 2:17, interior patrol resumed. I didn't ask who wrote it. I realized I wasn't alone when the motion sensor triggered behind me, even though I hadn't passed that point yet. The beep echoed down the warehouse, sharp and brief, then faded back into silence. I stopped walking immediately, one boot still half lifted off the concrete floor. My flashlight beam froze on the yellow line painted along the aisle, and my heart started beating harder than it should have for something so small. I knew exactly where that sensor was. It was mounted near the emergency exit at the far end of the building, at least 40 meters behind me. I hadn't gone near it yet on this round. I hadn't even turned down that aisle. For a few seconds, I stood there listening, waiting for the second beep that never came. I worked overnight security at a cold storage warehouse. Frozen food, medical supplies, things that needed strict temperature control. The building was sealed tight, insulated walls, heavy doors, constant refrigeration hum that never shut off. The kind of place where sound traveled strangely and time felt slower than normal. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I was the only guard on site overnight. That wasn't unusual. The warehouse sat far from residential areas, surrounded by empty lots and chain link fencing. Nothing ever happened there. That was the whole point. Until that night. The routine was simple. Every hour, I walked a fixed patrol route. I scanned checkpoints with a handheld device, checked doors, noted temperatures, and logged anything unusual. Most nights, the most exciting thing that happened was a forklift alarm malfunctioning or a freezer unit cycling louder than usual. That night started the same way. The first two patrols passed quietly. The air was cold but stable. The refrigeration units droned steadily. My boots crunched softly on the concrete dust near the loading bays. Everything scanned green. By the third patrol, the building felt different. Not louder, not darker, just stretched, like the distance between things had subtly changed. It took longer to reach the end of aisles. My footsteps sounded like they lagged behind me, echoing a fraction too late. I remember slowing down without realizing it. That was when the sensor beeped. I turned slowly, sweeping my flashlight back toward the emergency exit. The beam cut through rows of stacked crates and wrapped pallets, casting long shadows that climbed the walls. Nothing moved. The exit door was still shut. The green indicator light above it glowed steadily. I checked my scanner. That checkpoint hadn't been logged yet. If you were there, you might have told yourself it was a system delay. I remember thinking. Sensors misfire. Devices lag. That explanation fit easily enough to keep moving. So I turned back around and continued the patrol, even though my shoulders stayed tense the rest of the way. A few minutes later, I reached the checkpoint near the freezer corridor. I raised the scanner, aimed it at the tag, and waited for the confirmation beep. It didn't come. I tried again. Nothing. The scanner screen flickered, then displayed a message I'd never seen before. Last scan, 2:38. I checked my watch. 2:12. I stared at the numbers, my breath fogging faintly in the cold air. That time wasn't just wrong. It was ahead of me by more than 20 minutes. I lowered the scanner and looked down the corridor. The freezer hallway was long and narrow, lined with thick insulated doors on both sides. Each one led to a separate cold room. The lights inside the hallway were dimmer than the main floor, and the refrigeration units made the air vibrate faintly. At the far end of the corridor, one of the doors was open. Just a crack. That wasn't possible. Those doors sealed automatically. If one was open, alarms should have been blaring. Temperature warnings should have been flashing on my device. Nothing was. I stood there, watching the thin black line of darkness between the door and the frame. Cold air spilled out in slow waves, carrying a deeper chill than the rest of the building. I took one step forward, then stopped. From inside the cold room, something moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just a subtle shift like weight settling. I waited. Seconds stretched. The refrigeration hum filled my ears. My fingers tightened around the flashlight handle until they ached. Then the door began to close. Slowly, smoothly, as if pulled by someone careful not to make noise. It shut with a soft, padded thump, and the latch clicked into place. I didn't approach it. I turned around and walked back toward the main floor, my pace steady but my pulse racing. I didn't want to run. Running felt like admitting something was wrong. Halfway back, my radio crackled. "You there?" The voice was faint, distorted by static, but unmistakably human. I stopped again. "Front desk." I asked. Silence. I pressed the talk button harder than necessary. "This is Patrol." "Say again." The radio crackled once more. Then a voice came through, clearer this time. "Did you finish the freezer check?" Something about the question made my stomach drop. "No," I said slowly. "I'm on my third round." A pause. "That's not what the log says." My eyes drifted to the scanner in my hand. "What do you mean?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "It shows you completed the freezer corridor at 2:38, the voice said. "You scanned all doors." I swallowed. "I'm standing outside it right now," I said. One of the doors was open. The radio hissed softly. I imagined the person on the other end frowning at their screen, trying to make sense of what I'd said. "That door hasn't opened all night," the voice replied. "No alerts. No temperature changes." I looked back down the corridor. All the doors were closed. Every single one. I felt suddenly exposed, standing in the open space between aisles, the cold air pressing in from all sides. "Can you check the cameras?" I asked. The radio crackled again. "Already did. You're not on them." "What?" The word came out sharper than I intended. "You were earlier," the voice said. "But right now, there's no movement on your route." I turned in a slow circle, sweeping my flashlight across the floor. "I'm right here," I said. "I'm walking." The radio stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then the voice returned, lower now. "Stay where you are." I didn't ask why. I stood there, barely breathing, listening to the refrigeration unit cycle on and off. My flashlight beam shook slightly as my hand started to tremble. After what felt like forever, the radio crackled again. "There's movement now," the voice said. near the freezer corridor. That's behind me, I whispered. Yes, the voice agreed, and it's following your patrol pattern. A cold realization settled in my chest. Whatever the system had logged at 02:38, it wasn't me. I didn't turn around. I stayed exactly where I was until the front desk called local security to come on site. When backup arrived, they found nothing out of place. No open doors, no temperature drops, no extra footprints. The logs still showed a complete patrol 20 minutes in the future. I quit that job the next morning. A month later, I ran into the front desk supervisor at a grocery store. We talked briefly, awkwardly about work and schedules. Before we parted ways, he hesitated. By the way, he said, we fixed that camera issue. What issue? I asked. The one where you kept appearing twice on the same feed, he replied. Once walking ahead and once lagging behind, like a delayed reflection. I didn't ask him to explain. I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. The elevator shouldn't have stopped on my floor. I remember noticing that before anything else. The slow deceleration, the soft mechanical sigh, the way the numbers above the door changed from 2 to 1, even though I hadn't pressed anything. I was standing in the security office, coffee still warm in my hand, watching the camera feeds when the elevator ding echoed through the warehouse. I stared at the monitor. No one was scheduled to arrive overnight. No deliveries, no maintenance, no exceptions. And yet, the elevator doors were opening. I worked overnight security at a vertical warehouse. Not wide like most distribution centers, but tall. 6 floors stacked on top of each other, connected by a freight elevator large enough to move pallets between levels. Each floor had its own rows of shelving, its own temperature zone, its own silence. My patrol route rotated by night. Some shifts I stayed mostly on the ground floor. Other nights, like this one, I worked top to bottom, riding the elevator between floors to save time. The elevator was old but reliable, loud, slow, predictable. Predictable enough that I knew when something wasn't right. The camera feed showed the elevator doors sliding open onto floor 1. No one stepped out. The doors stayed open longer than usual, then closed again. I set my coffee down and leaned closer to the screen, rewinding the footage. I watched it again. The doors opened. Empty interior. No movement. No shadows shifting. Nothing. I checked the call log. No button presses recorded. The system hadn't registered a request from any floor. I told myself it was a glitch. If you were there, you might have done the same. Systems hiccup. Sensors misfire. Especially overnight, when everything is quiet and your brain fills in gaps that don't exist. Still, I made a note in the logbook. 146, elevator cycle, no call registered. Then I went back to watching the feeds. For the next hour, nothing happened. The building settled into its usual overnight rhythm. Fans hummed. The lights buzzed faintly. The camera feeds showed empty aisles and unmoving shelves. I rode the elevator twice during my patrol, both times without issue. It groaned and rattled like it always did, carrying me between floors with familiar slowness. By the time I reached floor 4, I'd almost forgotten about the earlier stop. Almost. Floor 4 was the quietest level. Mostly long-term storage, fewer motion sensors, less foot traffic even during the day. At night, it felt abandoned in a way the other floors didn't. The doors opened, and I stepped out, my boots echoing softly on the concrete. I scanned the checkpoint near the elevator, got the confirmation beep, and started down the main aisle. That was when I noticed the elevator doors closing behind me. They closed faster than usual. I stopped walking and turned around, watching them slide shut with a sharp metallic clack. The indicator above them flickered briefly, then went dark. That wasn't normal. The indicator was supposed to stay lit. I walked back toward the elevator and pressed the call button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again, harder. Still nothing. I frowned and checked my radio. Full signal. I pressed the talk button. "Front desk," I said. "Elevator on floor 4 isn't responding." Static crackled briefly. Then the voice of the other guard came through. "Copy. You're on floor 4. "Yeah," I said. Just stepped out. Doors closed on their own. Panels dead. A pause. Then, "That's weird. It shows the elevator parked on floor 1. I stared at the closed doors. "I'm looking at it," I said. "It's right here." Another pause, longer this time. "Stand by," the voice said. "I'll check the system." I stepped back, shining my flashlight along the seam of the doors. Everything looked normal. No warning lights. No alarms. Just metal and silence. While I waited, I turned and scanned the aisle. Something was off. The shelves looked the same as always, but the spacing between them felt wrong. Like the aisle was longer than it should be. The far end seemed farther away, the darkness thicker. I shook my head slightly, annoyed at myself, and focused on my breathing. Overnight shifts played tricks on your perception. You learn to ignore that. The radio crackled again. "Okay," the voice said. "System says the elevator hasn't moved since your last ride. Log stop was floor 1. "That's not possible," I replied. "I just came up. Camera feed shows floor 4 elevator bay empty," the voice said. I turned slowly, flashlight sweeping across the wall where the elevator doors stood. They were gone. Where the elevator should have been was just a blank stretch of concrete wall. No doors, no seams, no panel, just uninterrupted gray, like it had never existed. My chest tightened. "I'm standing in front of it," I said quietly. Silence answered. I took a step back, then another, my flashlight beam trembling slightly. The wall didn't change. There was no sign the elevator had ever been there. The radio crackled faintly. "Say again." "There's no elevator here," I said. "It's just gone." The line stayed quiet for a few seconds. When the voice returned, it sounded cautious. "Stay where you are," it said. "Do not move." I almost laughed. The instruction felt absurd. The entire floor felt wrong. Staying still felt like the worst thing I could do. "I'm going to walk the aisle," I said. "Check the other stairwell." "You don't have a stairwell on floor 4, the voice replied. I froze. "Yes, we do," I said. "East end." Another pause. "No," the voice said slowly. "Stair access stops at floor 3. I stared down the aisle again. At the far end, a door stood beneath a glowing exit sign. I'd used it before. I was sure of it. "I'm looking at it," I said. "Exit sign and everything." The radio hissed softly. "There is no exit door on that floor." I didn't respond. Instead, I started walking. Each step echoed too loudly, the sound bouncing back at me in a way that made it hard to tell how far I'd gone. The shelves on either side seemed taller now, their shadows stretching up into darkness. My flashlight beam felt weak, swallowed by the space. Halfway down the aisle, I heard the elevator again, the distant groan of metal cables. the low hum of movement. Behind me, I stopped and turned. The elevator doors were back. They stood exactly where they should have been, lights on, indicator glowing faintly. The doors were open. Inside, the car was dark. No interior lights, just blackness. The radio crackled. "We see it now," the voice said. "Elevator just appeared on camera." "Appeared?" I asked. "Yes," the voice replied. "It wasn't there a second ago." I took a slow step backward. The elevator doors began to close. "Wait," I said, not sure who I was talking to. The doors paused halfway, as if listening. Then they opened fully again. Inside the car, something shifted. Not a person, not clearly, just a change in the darkness, like the absence of light rearranging itself. If you were there, I remember thinking, you might have convinced yourself it was just bad lighting. I didn't. I felt watched. The radio crackled louder. "Do not enter the elevator," the voice said firmly. I nodded, even though no one could see me. "I'm not," I whispered. The elevator dinged. The indicator flickered to floor 5. The doors started to close again. This time, I didn't tell them to stop. They slid shut with a heavy thud, and the indicator numbers began to climb. 2, 3, 4. The elevator was going up, above me, to a floor that didn't exist. There was no floor 5. The building only had 4 levels. I stood there, staring at the wall where the doors had been, listening to the sound of cables moving upward, disappearing into the ceiling. When the sound stopped, the warehouse went quiet again. Too quiet. The radio crackled. "It just stopped," the voice said. "But there's no record of where." "I want off this floor," I said. "Stay put," the voice replied. "Help is on the way." I didn't wait. I turned and ran. The aisle seemed to stretch endlessly, my footsteps pounding against the concrete. The exit door at the far end felt impossibly distant, the exit sign flickering faintly as if struggling to stay lit. When I reached it, I yanked the handle. It opened. Behind it was another aisle, identical to the one I'd just run down. I stumbled back, heart racing, and turned around. The door was gone. I don't remember how long I walked after that. Time felt broken on that floor. Every aisle led to another aisle. Every turn brought me back to the same shelves, the same hum, the same oppressive stillness. Eventually, I heard voices, real ones, shouting my name. Hands grabbed my shoulders, grounding me, pulling me backward. The air felt warmer suddenly, brighter. I was on floor 1, lying on the concrete near the elevator bay. The doors stood open, lights on, perfectly normal. They told me I'd been unresponsive for 12 minutes. The camera footage showed me stepping into the elevator on floor 4 and never stepping out. I never went back to that job. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that extra floor, about what the elevator was carrying up there, and what might still be riding it, waiting for someone to press the button again. I noticed the clock first because it had stopped making sense. It was mounted above the security desk, big red digital numbers that were impossible to miss. I checked it every few minutes without thinking. A habit, a way to mark time when nothing else changed overnight. When I glanced up and saw it still read 3:14, I felt a small, dull irritation. I was sure more time had passed than that. I looked at my watch. 3:29. I looked back at the clock. 3:14. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at it, waiting for the numbers to flip. They didn't. The seconds weren't moving either. The dots between the numbers stayed solid, frozen in place. I worked overnight security at a fulfillment warehouse that handled returns. Not new items. Things that had already been owned, already used, already sent back for reasons no one really cared about. The building always felt different because of that. Less clean, less neutral, like it carried a residue of other people's lives. My job was to patrol the interior and monitor cameras. One guard per shift. No overlap. No backup unless something serious happened. That night, nothing serious was supposed to happen. I tapped the clock with my knuckle. It didn't respond. No flicker. No change. I sighed, made a note in the logbook about a possible power issue, and picked up my flashlight. The routine was the same every night. Walk the perimeter aisles. Check the locked cages. Pass through the returns processing area. Loop back to the office. Repeat. The first patrol, after noticing the clock, felt normal enough. The warehouse hummed with its usual low noise. Conveyor belts sat still. Motion sensors stayed inactive. My footsteps echoed in a predictable way. Still, I kept thinking about the clock. When I came back to the office, I checked it again. 3:14. My watch now read 3:47. That was when unease started to creep in. Not panic, just a quiet, crawling sense that something had slipped out of alignment. I radioed the front gate out of habit, even though there wasn't anyone stationed there overnight. "Control check," I said. Only static replied. That wasn't unusual. Reception inside the building was bad. I clipped the radio back to my belt and grabbed the clipboard. As I turned to leave, I noticed the logbook. A new entry had appeared beneath mine. Same pen, same ink, same handwriting. 3:14, interior patrol completed. I stared at it, my mouth dry. I hadn't completed the patrol. I was about to start it. If you were there, you might have tried to explain it away. Muscle memory, writing without remembering, fatigue. Overnight shifts blurred together, but I hadn't even left the office yet. I flipped back a page. More entries, all stamped with 3:14. Interior patrol started. Interior patrol paused. Interior patrol resumed. Interior patrol completed. All at the same time. My chest felt tight as I slowly closed the book. The warehouse seemed quieter now, like the background hum had been turned down just enough to notice. I stepped back onto the floor. That was when I realized the lights hadn't changed. Normally, the warehouse lighting cycled subtly throughout the night. Certain zones dimmed, others brightened. It helped save power. I knew the pattern by heart. Everything was fully lit. Every aisle, every corner. Bright, flat, unchanging light. No shadows shifting. No flicker. Just a constant artificial brightness that made it hard to judge distance. I walked the first aisle, counting my steps without meaning to. The shelves felt farther apart than usual. The far end of the aisle looked stretched. When I reached the end and turned the corner, I heard footsteps. Not echoes. Footsteps. They matched my pace exactly. I stopped. They stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Silence. I told myself it was just my own echo delayed by the shelves. That explanation almost worked. Almost. I started walking again. So did the footsteps. This time, they were slightly behind me. I didn't turn around. I finished the aisle and entered the returns processing area. Long tables, conveyor belts, bins filled with open boxes and discarded packaging. The air smelled faintly of dust and cardboard. The footsteps faded as soon as I crossed the threshold. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. At the far end of the processing area, a monitor glowed. It showed a live camera feed of the same room I was standing in. I wasn't on it. The room on the screen was empty. No guard, no movement, no flashlight beam. I stepped closer to the monitor, my heart pounding harder now. I waved one hand slowly in front of my face. Nothing changed on the screen. Then, on the monitor, someone walked into frame. They entered from the exact direction I'd come from. They were wearing my uniform, my jacket, my boots, my flashlight clipped to the same side. They stopped in the middle of the room and looked directly at the camera. I couldn't see their face clearly. The resolution wasn't good enough, but I knew without being told that they were looking straight ahead, standing exactly where I was standing now. The radio on my belt crackled. "Patrol complete," a voice said. It was my voice. I grabbed the radio, my hands shaking. "Who's on channel?" I demanded. The monitor version of me tilted their head slightly, like they were listening. The radio crackled again. "Time check, 3:14. I backed away from the monitor. The footsteps returned. This time, they were in front of me. I turned. The aisle behind me was empty, bright, still, but I could feel something there. Close, too close, like standing face to face with someone in the dark, even though the lights were on. If you were there, you might have frozen too, your body refusing to choose fight or flight. I forced myself to move. I walked quickly back toward the security office, resisting the urge to run. Running felt dangerous, like it might trigger something I couldn't undo. The clock still read 3:14. The dots still didn't blink. The logbook was open again. Another entry had been added. 3:14, guard returned to office. I dropped the clipboard and stepped back. "Stop," I said out loud, my voice sounding small in the empty room. "This isn't funny." The lights didn't change. The clock didn't move. Behind me, the office door clicked shut. I hadn't closed it. The radio crackled softly. Breathing came through the speaker. Slow, steady, familiar. I didn't turn around. The breathing stayed close, right on my shoulder, as if someone were standing inches behind me. Leaning in. "Shift's not over," my voice whispered from the radio. I squeezed my eyes shut. When I opened them, the clock finally changed. 3:15. The lights flickered. The breathing stopped. The door was open again. I didn't wait for anything else to happen. I walked out of the building, badge still clipped to my chest, radio still hissing quietly at my side. I never went back inside. Weeks later, I was called in to explain why the log showed continuous patrols completed at 3:14 every night for nearly a month, on nights when I wasn't even scheduled. They asked me if I knew who had been filling them out. I told them I didn't. But sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night and check the time, my phone screen lingers too long before updating. And for just a second, it always says 3:14. The alarm didn't sound the way it was supposed to. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. It was a single soft chime, almost polite, echoing once through the warehouse and then stopping. I remember looking up from my clipboard and feeling confused before I felt scared. That alarm was tied to the rear loading bay. If it triggered, it meant a door had opened. No delivery was scheduled. No one had access overnight except me, and a camera feed showed the bay exactly as it should be. Closed. I worked overnight security at a packaging warehouse that ran 24 hours during peak season and shut down completely at night during the rest of the year. This was one of the quiet months. No trucks, no forklifts, no workers, just me, the cameras, and a building that felt too large for one person. My patrol route was fixed. Every hour, same order, same checkpoints, same doors. I like that. Routine kept your mind from wandering. That alarm didn't fit the routine. I checked the monitor again, zooming in on the rear bay. The metal door was down. The locking bar was still in place. No motion, no shadows, nothing. I checked the system log. 302, rear bay access. I frowned and checked my watch. 2:47. The time mismatch made my stomach tighten. I leaned closer to the screen, scrolling back through the log. The entry was clean. No error codes. No partial trigger. It was logged as a full access event. Someone, or something, had opened that door. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed out. The walk to the rear bay took longer than usual. The warehouse aisles felt stretched, the distance between lights subtly wrong. My footsteps echoed back at me in a delayed way that made it hard to tell when I'd actually stopped walking. When I reached the bay, everything looked normal. The door was down. The lock was intact. The concrete floor was clean. No tire marks. No footprints. No cold air leaking in. I stood there for a full minute, listening. The warehouse was quiet in that deep, artificial way that made every sound feel important. Somewhere far above, metal ticked softly as it cooled. I radioed the front gate out of habit, even though no one was stationed there. "Control check," I said. Static answered. I logged the inspection and turned to leave. That was when the light above the bay flicked off. Just that one. The rest of the warehouse stayed bright. The sudden shadow made my skin prickle. I turned back, shining my flashlight up at the fixture. The bulb was dark, unbroken. I tapped the wall switch beside the bay. Nothing happened. I stepped backward slowly, my eyes adjusting to the uneven lighting. The shadow beneath the unlit bay felt deeper than it should have, like the darkness had weight. Then I heard it, a sound from behind the door. Not a bang, not scraping metal. Breathing. Slow, careful, like someone standing very close to the other side of the door, trying not to be heard. I froze. If you were there, you might have told yourself it was airflow. Pressure change. Pipes. Anything that let you keep standing there instead of running. I didn't move. The breathing stopped. Seconds passed. My heart hammered in my ears. I waited for the alarm to trigger again. It didn't. Then the lock handle on the door twitched. Just a millimeter. Enough to notice. I backed away, my flashlight beam shaking now. I raised the radio to my mouth. "Is anyone else on site?" I asked. Static. The handle twitched again. This time, the alarm chimed softly. Once. The system log updated on my tablet. 3:02. Rear bay access resumed. The time still didn't match. I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked fast and steady, forcing myself not to look back. Every instinct screamed at me to get distance, to put walls and light between me and that door. Halfway back to the office, the lights began turning off behind me. Not all at once. One section at a time, aisle by aisle. The darkness followed me at a slow, deliberate pace. I reached the office and slammed the door shut, locking it even though policy said not to. I leaned against it, breathing hard, listening. Nothing followed. The camera feeds were still live. I pulled them up with shaking hands. The rear bay camera now showed the door open, wide. The outside was black. No yard lights, no stars, just empty darkness where the loading yard should have been. And standing just inside the threshold was a figure. It didn't move. It didn't step in. It just stood there, facing the camera, as if waiting. I zoomed in. The figure was wearing a security jacket. My jacket. The radio on the desk crackled. "Patrol missed a checkpoint," my voice said calmly. I stared at the screen. The figure tilted its head slightly, mirroring the movement I hadn't realized I'd made. If you were there, you might have told yourself you were hallucinating, that exhaustion had finally caught up with you. I believe something else had caught up with me instead. I shut off the monitors. I shut off the lights. I left the office and walked out through the front entrance, never looking at the rear of the building again. The next morning, management reviewed the footage. The rear bay door never opened. The alarm never triggered. The log showed a complete patrol finished at 3:02. I was terminated for abandoning my post. Sometimes when I drive past that warehouse late at night, I see the rear bay light flick on. Just one. And for a moment, I swear I see someone standing there, waiting for the alarm to chime again. Which story stayed with you the longest? Let me know in the comments. New true horror stories are coming soon.